I'd now like to introduce Ken and Stacey's very good friend, Dr. Max Quanchi, Professor and world-renowned Pacific historian, to talk about Ken.
Thank you, Aidan. I'm not really that important, but I was one of Ken's friends and I had the privilege of going with him to Raobeia Island several times and to see Ken in action, asking questions, telling stories, checking facts, getting into arguments with all sorts of people because he wanted to get the full record and a really detailed record of his own people, the Bunnaban people, and their history. So it was very appropriate that we start this commemoration of Ken's life with talking about Bunnaban, hearing a Bunnaban sing. I want to talk about Ken. It's something he never boasted about. He never paraded the fact. And most of you probably don't even know that he was a historian. But I'm a historian, and I knew Ken as a historian. But he wasn't a historian like a university lecturer or an amateur historian. Ken was a historian because he was a spokesperson for his clan, for the Tiaka clan, which once lived on Bunnaban, but now live on Raobeia Island in Fiji. So Ken was a spokesperson for his clan. He wanted to find out about the history of his people, his own clan. And he'd been taught many things as a young boy on Raobeia, and he'd begun to ask questions about where did the run be, why are Bunnabans stuck on Raobeia Island? Why aren't Bunnabans on Bunnaban Island, where they come from? So that became a passion for Ken, to tell this story about the Bunnabans. And he did most of it with Stacey here, and I'll mention about a wonderful book that the two of them wrote about Bunnaban. So I think the most important, exciting event in Ken's life, and I'll probably get into trouble for saying this because other people say, oh, what about when he married me, or when what about when we had babies? And there are lots of important events in your life. But for me, knowing Ken as a historian, I think the most important event, most exciting thing in his life was in 1979, when he actually stood on the ground on Bunnaban Island. Now that was a pretty amazing thing to do, because Bunnabans were living on Raobeia Island in Fiji. They'd been dumped there, lied to by the British and dumped on this little island in Fiji and told, well, you might be able to go back to Bunnaban after the war because the Japanese have destroyed all the water and the infrastructure's all destroyed and you can't go back there. So the Bunnabans went to stay on Raobeia Island, and they're still there because the British, of course, had lied. What the British wanted to do was to mine the phosphate on Bunnaban Island without any impediment, without any local people there. So they removed the Bunnabans, wouldn't let them go home after the war, and then the British and Australians and New Zealanders continued to mine Bunnaban Island. So it must have been a wonderful feeling for Ken to go back from Raobeia. He sailed across from Raobeia over to Bunnaban. It's a very small island right up on the equator. And it must have been exciting for him because there were still remains of villages and there were still signs of where people had lived, Bunnaban people had lived, even though the mining had destroyed much of the island. There was still evidence of the original Bunnaban people who had lived on Bunnaban. And that was a great moment for Ken. That set him off to really find out, well, who were the original Bunnabans and who owned the land and what are the stories that need to be told. Later on, Ken went back to Bunnaban and he searched for archaeological remains and skeletal remains, and he made maps of where villages had been, and he was able to plot the history of the people of Bunnaban and how they'd occupied the land. And all of that goes into his book, which I'll mention in a moment. Ken didn't go back to Bunnaban then for 20 years. When he went back in 1997, the island was abandoned. The phosphate mining had ended, and Bunnaban had been given not to the Bunnaban people, but to Kiribati. So the British gave the island of Bunnaban and said, when Kiribati gets its independence, Bunnaban can become part of Kiribati, the former Gilbert and Ellice Islands. This is another tragic story in history as well. This means that Bunnabans are not the custodians of their own island. That's a terrible thing to feel. I mean, We know the story of Indigenous people all over the world and how many of them are alienated from their own lands. Well, Bunabans are alienated completely because they live in Fiji, in an island, Raobeia Island. Some have gone back and started to claim the land back, in a sense, squatting on it and saying it's ours, we want it back. So letting the world know about this became Ken's passion. He wanted to tell the world about this, but I think more so Ken really wanted to talk to children. He wanted to talk to the youth of Banaba, who are now on Rambi. He wanted them to understand their Banaban heritage. He wanted them to understand their original ownership of the island. He wanted them to understand how Banaba is an ancestral homeland. That became a passion. So Ken and Stacey, they took off on a massive task, and they created newsletters and websites and heritage societies. They set up a worldwide network of people who were interested in Banaba and telling this story of the Banaban people. And then, I can wave this book in my hand. This is a wonderful book. Historians regard this with great esteem because it tells the story of Banaba. And Ken and Stacey put this together in 2001, and then 20 years later they went and did a massive revision of it, and now it's available on Amazon. And it tells the story of Banaba. It's called The Backbone of Banaba. You might have noticed that Ken's name is Sigrah. This is not a name from Banaba. This is a name from Koshrai Island in Micronesia, into the North Pacific, because missionaries and then the Japanese sent Banabans to Koshrai during the missionary period and then during the Second World War as labour. So Ken has an ancestral family heritage to Koshrai as well as to Banaba. So Ken, in his task, took off and said, right, I'm going to tell this story. I want to tell the story of the Tiaka. These are the people who first occupied Banaba, the original descendants, the original people who sailed to that island in the middle of the ocean, settled there and created a Banaban culture and society. He also took on the task of telling the story of other clans that were on the island and how the island absorbed more people, more migrants over time. Then he wanted to tell the story of the Second World War. He wanted to tell the story of the mining. He wanted to tell the story of how the British gave Banaba away to Kiribati and took it away from the Banaban people. So this was a great passion of Ken's. So I want to finish just on one other really exciting thing that happened. And luckily it happened for Ken just recently. And that was, Ken had often been told the story of his ancestors, and he knew about an ancestor whose skull had been removed illegally in 1933. So this skull had been taken by a researcher who was working on the island, and he'd taken it and the skull had disappeared. It was somewhere in a museum or an archive, somewhere in the world. So Ken, that was a great passion of Ken and Stacey's, to track this down. Where is this skull? And eventually it was found, and it's going to be now taken back to Banaba. This is a promise that Ken had made 24 years ago. He had said to his elders, I will take back Teimana's skull, my ancestor's skull. I will bring it back to you. So that's going to happen soon. And Ken's ashes is going to go back at the very same time, so that Ken's ashes and the skull are going to go back. What a magnificent story that is to tell. So, Ken's kept a promise right at the end. Ken's name is always going to be associated in history with the history of Banaba. That's a memory all of us are always going to know him for that. What he's done for his own people, the Banaban people, and what he's done for the history of Banaba Island is absolutely something we should all be remembering. So Ken, thank you for everything you did. We miss you, mate.